Yo guys, what is up? Here we are with another reading video, and today we are on chapter 5 of Lost in the Pacific 1942 by Todd Olson. Today, oh yeah, I already said that. Wow. I can't think apparently. Here we are. Chapter 5. Things that go bump in the night. The water turned an inky black that night, and Eddie Rickenbacker couldn't sleep. An entire world throbbed beneath 3 tiny rafts. At its average, the Pacific Ocean runs 2.5 miles deep. In 1942, the Empire State Building stood as the tallest human-made structure in the world. Clouds sometimes obscured the tips of its spire, and yet almost 9 Empire State Buildings stacked one atop the other would fit between the rafts and the bottom of the ocean. There were creatures the size of buses down there. If a curious humpback whale decided to surface in the wrong place, the men would be scattered helpless on the waves. Then, of course, there were the sharks. Rickenbacker first felt the impact shortly after dark. Something swept past from below and bumped the flexible canvas floor of the raft. Then it happened again. A tail or a head broke the surface of the water a few feet away. Then another bump from below. One after another, the sharks that had been following them took turns scraping against the bottom of the rafts. When one hit just right, the men could feel the impact on the back of their legs. Just a fraction of an inch of rubberized canvas between human flesh and a predator. Sometimes the sharks rocked the rafts with a flip of their tails before vanishing into the dark again. It wasn't clear whether they were looking for a meal, but no one wanted to find out. The rafts felt insubstantial next to 1,000 pounds of muscle and teeth. Rickenbacker worried that the rough, scaly hide of a particularly aggressive shark could shred the canvas, leaving nothing between him and a swarm of ravenous killers. And so he lay in the moonlight, wide awake, waiting for the next nudge from below. Sleep would have been a welcome relief from the conditions in the raft. Rickenbacker's bed was barely the size of a bathtub, and he was sharing it with 2 grown men. Colonel Admonson, whose back was in bad shape, lay curled in one end. Rickenbacker and Bartek tossed and turned in the other half, trying to find an alignment they could live with. Every move they made provoked a groan from Admonson, one badly placed elbow, and the groan turned into a foul-mouthed grumbling. But even if Admonson hadn't been there, if the raft had been as big as a bedroom and equipped with a mattress, if the sharks had been merely tropical fish splashing about in the waves, Rickenbacker still would have not slept. They had agreed on a schedule of watch duty, but what if Bartek or Reynolds or the Angels dozed off and slept through the hum of a passing plane? What if Sergeant Alex mistook the lights of a ship for a pair of stars on the horizon? It didn't come naturally to Eddie Rickenbacker to leave his fate in someone else's hands. His parents had been dirt poor when they arrived in Columbus, Ohio, from Switzerland. His mother cleaned other people's laundry to pay back a $300 loan for their first house. By the time he was 5, Eddie was hawking newspapers to help support the family. To heat the house, he and his brothers scrounged for coal and dropped from passing trains. He grew up believing that you survived in this world on your own strength, knowledge, and initiative. A race car driver had his pit crew. A pilot had expert mechanics, but when it came down to it, there was just the driver, the car, and the road. The pilot, the plane, and the sky. Eddie Rickenbacker was convinced of one thing above all others. There was only one person he could rely on, and that was Eddie Rickenbacker. Finally, dawn came and the world began to lighten. A gray mist hung over the rafts as the air began to warm. They had been shivering all night in the cold salt spray, but now their bodies slowly began to heat up. The sharks, however, were still with them, circling like vultures, shouting across the swells. The men tried to figure out whether their stalkers saw them as prey or just a curiosity. The U.S. Army taught its flyers that the sharks aren't a danger to humans, but maybe the generals were just trying to calm their nerves. After all, the newspapers had a habit of referring to the Pacific as shark-infested waters. In early August, Japanese ships had sunk 3 American cruisers and a destroyer off of Guadalcanal. Rumor had it that as many as 1,500 men lost had been eaten by sharks. Bartek, for one, was convinced that the predators were looking for a chance to turn the men into dinner. dinner. Rickenbacker wasn't so sure. He spotted a 6-inch leech of some kind on one of the sharks' heads. He and Whitaker thought that when the sharks bumped the rafts from below, they were simply trying to scrape the parasites off their backs. And yet no one was willing to jump in and test the theory. When an arm or leg strayed close to the side of a raft, it was hastily yanked back. As the day brightened, Rickenbacker had the men pull the rafts close. No one mentioned it, but the old war hero had taken charge since they ditched the plane. His arrogance rubbed some of the men the wrong way. They were fiercely loyal to Sherry, and by the rules of the military, the captain of the plane was in charge until the mission was over. But there was something about Rickenbacker that commanded attention. When he spoke, there was no doubt in his voice. To 7 men stranded in the middle of the ocean, certainty was a comforting thing. With the rafts clustered tight, Rickenbacker launched into a pep talk. He was convinced they would be rescued soon. The planes are probably taking off now, and that $100 is still up, he said. In the meantime, he warned, they had to conserve energy. Move around as little as possible. Don't speak too much. Try to protect themselves from the sun. Most of all, don't drink the seawater, no matter how thirsty they got. Seawater is a lot saltier than the fluids in the human body. Drink it, and the body actually loses liquid trying to flush out all the excess salt. The men would dehydrate faster drinking salt water than drinking nothing at all. They had to be disciplined about everything, Rickenbacker said, including food. It had been 24 hours since Rickenbacker, Amundsen, Sherry, and Whitaker had sat in the cockpit, feasting on sweet rolls and coffee. The other men hadn't eaten since before they took off from Hawaii. Captain Sherry dragged their supplies, and they did the math, simple and grim. 4 oranges, 8 people, half an orange per person. Rickenbacker proposed that they eat 1 orange every day, dividing each one up evenly 8 ways. Reynolds and the others grumbled that they hadn't had breakfast the day before like the men in the cockpit. If we'd known before we went down, we'd have taken care of you, Rickenbacker replied. But now it's too late. The protest died away. They'd be rescued before they got to the second orange anyway, wouldn't they? Sherry handed the supplies to Rickenbacker. 7 men watched while the colonel pulled out a sheath knife, bent over an orange, and carved it like a jeweler into 8 precisely equal pieces. Most of the men ate their entire ration, peel and all. Rickenbacker and Sherry thought of another use for the peel. They pulled out the hook and line that DeAndros had salvaged from the parachute sacks. Each man baited a hook with a small piece of peel and threw it overboard. They watched while the lines trailed the raft, dangling their bright orange bait in the waves. The peel did not attract a single fish. Whitaker's watch, which miraculously still worked, ticked away the hours. The sun burned off the mist, and by 11 a.m., its glow ruled the sky. 4 hours ago, they'd welcomed the warmth. Now the heat was unbearable. Whitaker stripped off his undershirt and soaked it in the ocean. He draped it over his head and felt the cool water run down his face. Moments later, he was sweating under the makeshift canopy, losing precious liquid with each bead that appeared on his face. He was trying to hold the shirt inches above his head to let the breeze blow through. As the heat bore down, the wind picked up. The rafts rode the waves at an uneven pace. 1 minute, Whitaker's raft pulled ahead, jerking the raft on the other end of the line. A minute later, it lagged behind, banging into Rickenbacker, Amundsen, and Bartek. That brought the donut rocketing in from behind, with DeAndros and Alex clinging to its flimsy side walls. Every bump nudged tempers closer to the edge. Knees were forced into backs and elbows into heads. Skin already raw with salt chafed against the canvas. Amundsen growled in pain. Bartek complained that he didn't have enough space. Someone else moaned about the heat. Before long, angry snipping filled the air between the rafts. Captain Sherry made a makeshift sail with his T-shirt and 2 oars. It seemed to help keep the rafts apart, but it didn't solve the real problem. The men were getting anxious, and it wasn't just the close quarters or the heat. More than anything, it was the empty sky above them. As sunset approached, they had been drifting for more than 24 hours without a plane or boat in sight. The scorching heat receded, and in its place came their nagging feeling that they had been cavalier about their chances of being rescued. The basic captain had no idea where they were. What if no one else had picked up their SOS? The men couldn't help replaying the sequence of events that they had dropped them in the sea. Captain Sherry, DeAndros, and Bartek felt it all would have been avoided if they had taken their time if the first place failed. the octant could have been replaced, the new plane inspection, and the direction finder fixed. There was no point in saying it, but the thought was in the air like the whine of a mosquito. If Rickenbacker hadn't been in such a hurry, they would be safely en route from Canton to the Western Pacific right now. But that wasn't Rickenbacker's way. If you travel when there's a war on, he believed, you have to be willing to take risks. The enemy doesn't wait for engineers to check everything and check it again. There is no time for prissy safeguards in the Army. And so here they were, stranded somewhere in the Central Pacific. The angels had taken readings on the stars the night before. Now, with Whitaker's watch, he checked the exact time of sunset. 5 minutes earlier than the night before, he claimed. That meant they had drifted 50 miles during the day. In fact, they had traveled about 25 or 30, probably west and a little south. But where had they started? Rickenbacker pulled out the map of the Pacific, which had so far stayed dry enough to read. He and Sherry thought they had gone down west and north of Canton, which put them dangerously close to enemy waters. The Japanese-held Gilbert Islands lay 500 or 600 miles west and a little north of Canton. If they were right, they could easily be within range of Japanese planes. The angels believed they were south of Canton. If he was right, they were beyond the enemy's reach. But it also meant they were floating in a large triangle of empty ocean. Canton, the only inhabited land in the Phoenix Islands, lay at the northeast point of the triangle. The Gilberts occupied the northwest point. Another 600 miles to the south lay the Ellis Islands. They were lost in a vast no-man's land, and the entire triangle, not a single tiny crest of land broke the surface of the ocean. No regular shipping lanes crossed anywhere near their position. The supply route to Australia ran through Fiji and Samoa, another 500 miles south of the Ellises. One by one, the men confronted a grim possibility. They would be on their own. There might be planes up there searching for them, but inside the triangle lay 150,000 square miles of empty ocean. They hadn't been able to find an entire island when they were circling up there. Would the search planes really be able to spot 3 tiny rafts? They began to calculate their chances of finding land. If they were heading southwest, they might run into the Ellis Islands, but that entire chain made up only 10 square miles of land. It would take a miracle to wash up on 10 square miles of sand and coral and 68 million square miles of water. Rickenbacker spoke up with his own calculations. He claimed they could make it to Fiji, a much larger target, in 18 to 25 days. He didn't really believe it himself. In 18 days with no food, water, or shelter seemed like an eternity. But Rickenbacker felt that the men needed something to hope for. Fiji would have to do. As darkness fell, conversations trailed off. Bartek had stashed a Bible with his zippered cover in his pocket before they left the plane. Now he dug it out and read to himself. Captain Sherry pulled out the very pistol to send up a different kind of prayer. He stuck a flare in the barrel and aimed at the sky. The first one went nowhere. The second one rose and burned for a few seconds before dropping into the sea. The third one rose high, floated in his parachute, and turned the sky bright red for a minute and a half. For several minutes after it burned out, they peered into the darkness, hoping that a star might turn into the tail light of a plane. Finally, they settled in for another sleepless night. Adamson took out a pencil and scratched the date on the side wall of the raft. Thursday, October 22nd. The nearest piece of mainland United States lay at least 4,000 miles away, and the men could only wonder what their families were doing. It would have been midnight in California. Whitaker's daughter Shirley would be in bed. What would his son Thomas be up to at the Navy base in San Francisco? In Texas it was 2 a.m., and Sherry's 5-year-old daughter, Paula, was surely asleep. But what about Rickenbacker's wife, Adelaide, in New York, and Bartek's parents in their New Jersey house, where his sister's bed now lay empty? Did they know yet what had happened to the B-17? The men hoped it hadn't made the newspapers, because the headlines would surely declare them dead. But had their families gotten a phone call from the Army, a telegram, or the most ominous messenger of all, a man in uniform knocking at the front door? And that is the end of Chapter 5. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to leave a big thumbs up. Comment down below what you want me to read next. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button. See you guys in the next video.